Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Tonight's issue is China, and specifically the Canadian-Chinese connection, relationship, etc. Because it seems like every day or every second day, something new comes out in regards to Canada's relationship with China. And we've got Charles Burton, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Charles a few times before, and Charles, it seems like almost all the warnings that you provided, all the cautions that you gave us are coming home to roost. And I imagine you're not very happy with it, but you're probably proud that you were right, but not happy that it's actually coming true.
Exactly. I mean, I think that the fact that the government is going to come up with an Indo-Pacific policy that Mr. Trudeau indicated at the APEC meeting yesterday would include enhanced Canadian military presence in the Indo-Pacific, and that we have two parliamentary committees exploring two issues. The Special Committee on Canada-China Relations of the Commons will have 6 sessions to try and get to the bottom of these allegations of Chinese police operations in Canada. And the House Procedures and House Affairs Committee will be doing an investigation of the reports that CSIS had advised the Prime Minister back in January that there are 11 candidates for Parliament in the 2019 election who were illegally provided funding support and other support by China, and that the Chinese government has placed agents of their regime in those electoral campaigns and in the offices of some MPs. So, you know, there's a lot going on from that point of view. And I think that we'll probably start to get a bit more proactive in addressing Chinese state harassment of people in Canada, including the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. And maybe the government will decide that it's time for us to act on the Commons unanimous resolution that the Chinese government is involved in genocide against the Uyghurs. You know, there are just a lot of things out there. The policy hasn't come out yet, but they keep promising it in a few weeks. I think the deferral is probably because they're rewriting it successively as more and more revelations come out. And once we have the policy, we'll see how the government implements it. So there'll be more to talk about in the weeks ahead, but certainly there's just a lot of action on the China file. And I think it's a great thing that Canada's finally starting to recognize that we just cannot steer a middle road between China and the United States. We have to challenge China's malignant activities in Canada and China and abroad, and China's threat to the norms of diplomacy and trade and the international rules-based order. So, you know,
Malignant activities? Malignant?
Well, I think election interference, you know, of trying to put people into our parliaments pretty bad. Harassment of Canadians and others in our country is also pretty bad. Thuggish intimidation of people in China by Chinese police that enter our country under false visa pretenses is also pretty malignant. Genocide in China, definitely malignant. And China's use of economic coercion to achieve its political goals, such as we saw at the time that they wanted us to revoke our extradition treaty with the United States and release the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. You know, the non-tariff barriers applied to $30 million in trade in canola seeds and Quebec meat, plus the hostage diplomacy of Kovric favor. It does, you know, it does go beyond just sort of normal pushing the boundaries of the existing system. It's really, I think, an outrage to any kind of standard.
So let's go through each one of these issues in a little bit of detail if we could, but at the same time as all these very substantial issues came to the fore, what got the most press this past week is a conversation at this summit in Bali, I think it was, where Trudeau and Xi had a little tete-a-tete. And tell me what was that all about?
Well, the previous day, the Prime Minister had met with the President of China, you know, standing up in a crowded room between sessions for 10 minutes. And they discussed various things. Subsequently, the Prime Minister's office issued a statement to the press, or provided the press with a briefing. There's been no official readout of that meeting, and said that Mr. Trudeau engaged the Chinese president on issues like Ukraine, the North Korean ballistic missile tests, the interference by China in the Canadian political process. The next day, apparently just as Mr. Trudeau was maybe walking to get a coffee between meetings, Mr. Xi came up and cornered him, and using very aggressive language, accused him of releasing the content of what should have been a private interaction, and said that the way it had been characterized was not the way the meeting went. And then, made a threat against our Prime Minister to the effect that if you don't show respect, that I can't say what will happen next. And so that, of course, as you know, I'm a fluent Mandarin speaker, and Chinese is the language of my home. So I was able to pick up on the tone of that, and it did have a certain thuggish kind of content where you say, I can't really say what'll happen. It's sort of like, the Mafia Don making a threat against somebody without saying exactly what it'll be. And according to other reports, as Mr. Xi took off from this, engagement with our Prime Minister, his comment on the Prime Minister is very naive. I listened to the video. I couldn't hear that. I could hear he said something. I couldn't pick up that he characterized our Prime Minister as very naive, but很天真in Chinese. But others who may have sharper ears than me saw that, and that may be the way that Mr. Xi sees our Prime Minister. Certainly, the disdainful tone of the language he used is the kind of language that I can't imagine him using with any other world leader, especially not the American president. And, that transmits, I guess, disdain for our country, Canada, too. So we should be concerned about it. I think that, Mr. Xi is used to our government not airing our concerns about China's activities publicly. And, in the past, we've been quite restrained over response to China when the Parliament had the unanimous declaration that China is engaged in genocide in the Uyghur regions. The Prime Minister refused to attend the vote and has not said the word genocide. So, it's a change in policy. I think that one could attribute it to Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Ottawa last month. In that, after he was in Ottawa, Canada made a declaration that we would engage in a strategic dialogue with the United States on Indo-Pacific policy, and we requested admission to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework grouping that we had been excluded from by the U.S. Earlier in the year. I mean, that's a grouping of 14 countries, and one would normally expect that Canada would be a member of it. And then when the U.S. set up a security consortium for the Indo-Pacific, it consisted of Australia, the UK, and the U.S. My view of the map of the world is that the UK is not an Indo-Pacific country, but Canada is. So it seems that likely that the U.S. has made it clear to our government that if we want to continue to collaborate with the U.S. in institutions like the Five Eyes, that we have to change our approach to China and get more into line with our like-minded allies like Australia, US, UK, Japan, South Korea, Europe, and so on. So I think that change has been partially stimulated by pressure from the US that also, threatens consequences if Canada doesn't get more engaged with what other countries are doing with regard to trying to bring China into the international rules-based order and into compliance with the norms of diplomacy and trade and they're seriously out of sync with those right now.
This is a fascinating geopolitical relationship and has huge implications for Canada as well as, frankly, the world. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Charles Burton talking about Canada-China relationships and diplomacy and political interference and genocide and a whole bunch of other issues, and I guess trade, because
Yes.
one would presume, I guess, that the reason why the Canadian government hasn't been doing some of the things that you and maybe the United States think are warranted is because we wanted that trade. We wanted that economic benefit. And has that outweighed some of the issues? And it seems like you would think and the Americans think it's not worth it. Anyway, we're going to take a break. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Charles Burton on China. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is China and Canadian-Chinese relationships that have really gone through front page news. Every second day, it seems that there's a different issue that comes up. And we've just talked about this interaction between our Prime Minister and President Xi in the meetings in it was Bali, I believe it was in. Is that correct?
Yes, the G20 in Bali.
The G20 in Bali.
In Indonesia.
So our guest, by the way, is Charles Burton, who is a senior fellow with Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He was a professor at Brock University for numerous years. He actually worked in the Canadian Embassy in China, and he spent a fair amount of time. I think you almost grew up in China, and you speak Chinese fluently. Spent some time in Shanghai and elsewhere, and so you really are very intimate in and close and knowledgeable to China-Canadian relationships. Let's go through some of these issues one by one, if we could, so we can try to understand them. You and I spoke, during, maybe it was before the federal election, about actually, frankly, I don't even remember whether it was this federal election or 2 federal elections ago, but we spoke at one point in time about China getting involved in saying negative things, or at least we thought saying negative things in the press about some conservative, Chinese conservative politicians, such that you actually thought that they were influencing the vote. Now it comes out, and maybe you could describe exactly what has come out, but now it comes out that CSIS has supposedly informed the Prime Minister back, 12 months ago or 10 months ago that China was actually contributing to and involved in numerous different political campaigns. But I don't think we know what the impact was. I don't think we know what parties that they were supporting. Is that the case? Tell us a little bit about that issue, if you could.
Yes, I mean, Sam Cooper of Global News obtained a leaked CSIS assessment to the Prime Minister that said that they were aware that there were 11 candidates who had been funded through the Chinese Consul General in Toronto, and that the Chinese Consul General had arranged for agents of the Chinese state to be placed in these election campaigns and in the offices of some MPs. The Prime Minister has acknowledged that report, the CSIS report, is true. And as you say, he had released it in July 2022, in other words, 10 months ago. So we don't know what the political affiliations were of those 11 candidates, but we hear that it's not just the Conservatives. I think that the issue here is that the Prime Minister received this information quite some time ago, and one would have expected that by now the RCMP would have acted on this information, and that if there are 11 candidates who knowingly have received funds from a foreign state against the laws of our election, you're not allowed, foreigners are not allowed to contribute to Canadian candidates' electoral campaigns, that those MPs or candidates would be brought up to be made accountable before the courts. If the evidence is there, then surely we wouldn't just let them get away with it, particularly if that was instrumental in them becoming parliamentarians. And similarly, one hasn't heard of any staffers in MPs' offices having been fired because they turns out that they were loyal to a foreign country and not to our country, Canada. So that's sort of where the issue is. But we need to get the details and see what happens now that the matter will be before the Parliament.
I apologize, but excuse me. When we thought that when someone in the United States, some people in the United States thought that Russia was influencing the election, wasn't there an impeachment trial over that? You say we need more information, but But if they actually influenced, and we were in a minority parliament, so if they had influence over 11 candidates, pro or con, helping them get elected or helping them get defeated, that could have changed the balance of power. That could have changed who's in government. Like, isn't this a bigger issue, sir?
It's a huge issue. And I mean, as you say, we know that they supported 11, but we also know that the Chinese state, or at least Chinese language media available to Canadians of Chinese origin in Canada, said false things about some candidates in the last election, particularly Kenny Zhao, who, was sponsoring a private member's bill to require that people involved in the China policy process would have to be transparent about any benefits that they received from a foreign state, in other words, from China. So, you've got the candidates they wanted in, and then you have the candidates they wanted out. Could this have made a difference in the election? Well, we'll never actually know, because we don't know, what decision informs a Canadian going to the polling station and putting their ballot in the box, and we don't know what determines which candidate they want to support. So we can't come up with anything definitive, but election interference is extremely serious, and one would expect that the police would be all over it in a big way. But when the information came out about Mr. Zhao, and Elections Canada was approached with these allegations of disinformation spreading in media available in Canada about a candidate, the Elections Canada said, "Oh, that's a national security issue, and we would have to refer it to our partner." So nothing was done. The real issue here is what happens in the next election. Of course, we should try and deal with candidates who came into power based on campaign practices that violated the law, but we also want to make sure that this doesn't happen again in the next election. And as you say, it could have affected the result. We just don't know. And then there's the other very large issue, which is, we want more parliamentarians and members of provincial legislatures who are of Chinese ethnic origin. We want our parliament to reflect the diversity of our country. And so we don't want every person with a Chinese name who runs for office to be besmirched by the idea that they might be agents for a foreign power. So, it's a very hard row to hoe. You want to encourage more Chinese candidates, but on the other hand, I think we really need to be putting a lot more resources into ensuring that any candidates, whether they're Chinese ethnic origin or other ethnic origins, are not receiving illegal support by a foreign government, because that ruins our democratic process, and just that should really be a very red line for our government. And regardless of whether the Chinese government supports more of the candidates of one party than another party, it doesn't matter. It's our democracy that's at stake.
I guess one of the other questions I got to ask you, sir, and you may not know, but when you think about some of the rumors of Russian influence in the American election, then there were rumors of Russian influence in the Canadian election, maybe potentially supporting the truckers' convoy and the occupation, or whatever you want to call it, in Ottawa. Then there were rumors of Russian support of the Brexit side of or the Leave side of the Brexit referendum, et cetera. And so therefore, once someone does it one place, one would think that they probably do it a lot of other places. So if China's doing this in Canada, comparable to my Russian analogy, aren't they likely trying to influence elections in a lot of other countries as well, particularly
absolutely.
Chinese minorities?
I've written about this before. The Chinese Communist Party United Front Work Department has a program of attempting to influence policymakers in foreign countries around the world. And that includes, providing benefits to people who are in the policy process, or suggesting that there would be benefits to politicians that don't seriously address the China threat while they're in a position of public trust, but that after they leave office, they will be rewarded with what my colleague Charlie Parton at the Royal United Services Institute in Britain says is life-changing amounts of money. We can't actually say that anyone who is recipient of largesse from China after they leave office is doing anything wrong. There were the revelations about the Australian Minister of International Trade, Andrew Robb, who was found, and he acknowledged it was true, after he left office, or some say before he left office, was the recipient of an $880,000 a year private consultancy with a Chinese Communist Party linked billionaire. Nothing illegal here. I think we just need more legislation to ensure that people who are receiving benefits from a foreign state will be declaring it, so we'll know that there could be potential conflict of interest there. This came up in the Conservative leadership campaign with Jean Charest's retainer from Huawei, that some reports, I can't verify them, say he was receiving $70,000 a month over a 3-year period from Huawei for legal services, but that information only came out later in the campaign, after he had already expressed some views that I would have disagreed with regard to Huawei. So, I just think that we need to make it transparent, and if there's a requirement that these benefits from a foreign state are made public, I think that'll have a considerable dampening effect on people who may be a bit naive and a bit greedy. I'm not saying that of Mr. Charest or anybody, but that you'd think twice before you responded positively to a Chinese Communist Party approach by a diplomat or agent of the Chinese regime here in Canada.
Should I think differently about a lawyer that is in the business of consulting with companies and providing advice to companies like Jean Charest, or versus a former minister of international trade, that one would think we've got rules about how long they have to wait before they can lobby government, etc.
Yeah, I think that we need better rules that extend for a longer period. It is always troubling. I mean, if you have lawyers are supposed to defend their client. You have a lot of lawyers who are defending criminals and presumably being paid by the proceeds of crime, and that's how our system works. So I think that you make a good distinction there, that a lawyer is in a position of defending their client, but maybe we should require that lawyers who have had positions of trust should reveal who their clients are. But Mr. Charest was reluctant to do that for professional reasons. So it's a different kind of ball game there.
And then this other report comes out, and please explain it to me, that we have information that there's actually Chinese police that are operating in Canada?
Yes, I mean, we know about 50, permanent facilities for Chinese police to operate in foreign countries around the world, and they identified 3 of them in Toronto. And I've heard that there's likely there'll be one that will be shown to be in Richmond, BC, and I would imagine Calgary would likely have one too. This has been a long time issue that I've also, highlighted in the past, including in Parliament, where we don't have an extradition treaty between Canada and China because, the Chinese government doesn't have due process of law. They don't follow the internationally accepted rules of evidence. They engage in torture and interrogation, and the death penalty is applied to a very wide range of offenses. So we don't have an extradition treaty, but China wants to get people back to China who, some of whom are in fact triad gang, international organized crime figures, some of whom are Chinese officials who got on the wrong side of a political factional struggle and have decamped to Canada with large sums of money of doubtful, uncertain provenance, who may be investing in real estate in places like British Columbia. And then you have some political dissidents that China would like to have silenced by returning them to China and putting them through a Chinese court process that wouldn't be consistent with our norms. So
are they here like bounty hunters and abducting people, or persuading them to return, or like what's going on?
There has been some abductions. These are relatively rare. I mean, this is like put a bag over the head and put them on a boat. There was a case of a Hong Kong bookseller, Gui Minhai, who left Thailand he was at his holiday home in Pattaya, Thailand, and exited Thailand without going through the Thai exit procedure. So we believe that he was kidnapped and then reemerged in China. But in this case, it seems to be mostly about putting pressure on people to return by menacing their families. And so saying, if you don't come back, this, that, and the other thing will happen to your family. In the case of Lai Changxing, major smuggler, I mean, really huge smuggler. He was responsible for something like 1/3 of the oil coming into China at one stage, bribed something in the order of, I believe, over 500 Chinese officials, including a deputy minister of the Chinese police. Anyway, he came to Canada, and there was a refugee hearing held at which I was the government witness. And at that time, the Chinese police who came, who were presenting evidence that Mr. Lai was an honest-to-God criminal and not, as he said, a victim of Chinese political factionalism, they admitted that they had entered Canada illegally and had brought Mr. Lai's brother, who at the time was incarcerated in a Chinese prison and who subsequently died in the prison after he returned to China. They came with his brother on a false visa, having received a fake invitation from a Canadian firm that these people were coming into, I forget what it was, fertilizer or wheat or something. But in fact, they were coming to see Mr. Lai and try and intimidate him into heading back to China, because if he didn't, they threatened dire consequences.
I can't believe what you're telling me. This sounds like a scene from The Godfather when Michael Corleone brings the brother of someone in front of Congress to the congressional hearing.
Well, this is actually in the transcript, and the Chinese police apologized. But as far as I know, I'm not aware of any consequences for the Canadian firm that issued the fake letters of invitation. And so the matter seemed to have just been papered over because Canada was, I think, keen to, the Canadian government wanted Mr. Lai to be returned to China because, we were aware that he was still involved with criminal gangs here in Canada. He was found to violate his release conditions by consorting with a Chinese triad called the Big Circle Boys in Calgary. And he had been arrested in the Niagara Casino, where he'd been engaged in what appeared to be money laundering. He was losing $70,000 US a night, continued to gamble for 2 weeks until the RCMP came and detained him again. So, it's a pretty clear case.
How is that laundering if all you're doing is losing?
Well, you're not. I mean, you're not losing at all. You're putting in, $1 million, losing 70 million, and then getting a check from the casino where you cash in your chips, which then you can invest in real estate with or whatever. I don't know. But money laundering through casinos is a method that we have been cracking down on. The Cullen Commission out in BC looked into this fairly closely, but I think it still goes on, particularly when the patrons of the casino are coming with large quantities of small bills wrapped up in rubber bands, which is not the way you get money from the bank. We have them, according to the Cullen Commission, there were persons of Chinese, from China who were coming into the casino with hockey bags full of used bills and cashing them in for chips and not necessarily even gambling. You could just buy the chips, walk around the casino 3 times, go back to the cashier and get a check. So, that kind of activity was really like sort of hiding in plain sight, which is a lot of this Chinese activity in Canada.
Hiding in plain sight.
They don't go to great lengths to hide it. It goes on, and we just are expected to accept it.
Okay, so we're going to take a break and come back, and I'm going to ask you why. Why do we do this? Okay.
The answer is trade.
Money.
Money, indeed.
Okay, we're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with Charles Burton, an expert on China, senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute, professor, former diplomat, and a person who spent a fair amount of time in China. We're talking about China, and we're gonna ask him about what's going on. Why do we accept all this? Stay with us, everyone. Fascinating conversation. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Charles Burton. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We're talking about China. And Charles, you just talked about a bunch of the things that we sort of accept in plain sight, and we do it, you think, for money. Are we that desperate?
Well, I think that, there has been a view in the government, it may be changing, that our main interest in relations with China is the promotion of Canadian prosperity through trade and investment and the diversification of our economic reliance on the United States. So, there are important, large Canadian companies who naturally have a lot of influence in the Prime Minister's office and political process because, they create jobs and they raise prosperity for our country. But that they urge, and I think basically because their Chinese partners tell them to, that if Canada, doesn't turn a blind eye to China's, say, espionage, our obtaining illegally dual-use military technologies through labs and universities, or the whole question of the Winnipeg Labs scandal that we still haven't been able to get the information on why two scholars of Chinese origin were removed from that lab for security reasons, or the harassment of people in Canada, Hong Kong Chinese, Uyghurs, Tibetans, mainland Chinese democracy advocates, and so on. I mean, all of these issues that we have just, more or less swept under the carpet because the feeling was that if we did anything that the Chinese embassy would be unhappy about, that China would retaliate through economic coercion by limiting our trade or not purchasing our commodities. This line, was to some extent exaggerated in terms of the characterization of how dependent Canada is on China trade. In fact, the real statistics show that only about 4% of our commodities trade goes to China, and most of that is agricultural products and minerals, potash, soybean seeds, and soybeans and so on. And for those things, there is a global market. So if China isn't buying from Canada, they have to buy from somewhere else, which opens up a market space for us. So what we're looking at in the new Indo-Pacific policy is a desire to diversify our markets and to, particularly in other Indo-Pacific countries, to get markets that we can rely on, where our partners are more trustworthy and that we won't be subject to potential economic coercion by China if we're selling too much into that one market. And the Prime Minister at APEC announced a number of measures to try and improve our access to other markets there. Indonesia, for example, is a huge market. And so I think that we're aware of the issue and we're trying to do something about it. And I hope that we can be successful in maintaining our levels of trade without being too dependent on one market, which, poses a threat to Canada in all sorts of ways. I mean, what if there was a war? What if war came out over Taiwan? Canada would obviously not be able to sell into China. We need to have a guarantee that we can sell elsewhere.
But Charles, this issue's got to be a similar one for the United States, for Australia, for New Zealand. Everyone's got economic connections with China and wants to have prosperity for their local population. Why is it different here?
Well, I think other nations have already taken the action to a large extent, and I think we need to be doing more coordinated action. The Prime Minister met with the U.S. Vice President yesterday and said that we would be working more closely with the United States on Indo-Pacific. I mean, if we had a situation where China imposed unfair non-tariff barriers or retaliatory measures on one country that's selling something, and they've done this quite explicitly with Australia with the wine, that the other countries would promise not to increase their exports of the same commodity to China. So, if China decides to punish Australia, Canada shouldn't say, oh, there's a great opportunity for us to sell more of our stuff, that we would have an agreement that we would hold back and not jump into the space that China's provided for us. That still hasn't happened, but I know the idea is out there, and the idea of working more closely to prevent China from, dividing and ruling in effect, or splitting countries over relations is a good one. I think in the past, Canada's often thought, well, the U.S. can pick up the slack on addressing China, and Canada can benefit from getting more market access. And if the U.S. won't allow Chinese scholars to cooperate in U.S. labs, that maybe that's an opportunity for Canada to get these very smart scientists in working in our research institutions. There are a lot of stuff like that, and I think that the U.S. is just not going to tolerate Canada's sort of two-faced approach, if that's what it is anymore. And I think that our government and people are coming around to that as well, as you say, from all of the stuff that's been coming out in the media and government statements.
A Canadian senator supposedly made some speech about Chinese espionage at Canada's largest power utility. What's that about?
Yeah, this is the first case that we've had of economic espionage being successfully brought to court. And Hydro-Quebec has a very large research facility, I think about 500 people, of which 250 or so are working on battery technology. In other words, how to make more efficient, smaller, cheaper batteries. And this kind of technology is not only, an economic thing for how you make better and cheaper electronic vehicles, but it has direct impact on things like military drones, military robotics, and stuff like that. So the RCMP has charged a person of Chinese origin, Wang Yesheng, with transferring the technology that he was working on for Hydro-Quebec to the Chinese state. And so we'll see if these charges are able to be proven and stick. It would be, I think, of great benefit if, in fact, one of the, at least one person is made to account for transferring Canadian technology to a Chinese state. I would say in this case, the matter was discovered by the corporate security of Hydro-Quebec, and they then handed the matter to the RCMP. It's not as if the RCMP has been successful in finding any who are working in, say, Canadian government research institutions like the Canadian National Research Council, which does a lot of work in the aerospace area, or the other areas where Canada plays a cutting-edge role in contributing to forwarding the boundaries of knowledge in sensitive technologies. But we need to be much more onto this. And we know from reports from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that Canada is evidently number 3 in the world for China's attempt to obtain these technologies after the US and the UK. But of course, Canada has a much smaller population. So, I think the fact that there are no consequences for people who engage in this sort of transferring of technology makes this a much more open place for it. Other countries, have been prosecuting like 12 or more a year, and Canada, after many, many years, is finally bringing one of them to court. And we'll see if we can make the charges stick based on our, unfortunately, rather weak laws in this regard.
So, Charles, what do we got to do? You're saying that we've been left out of a couple different organizations. I think you called it the Five Eyes, that we were either left out or we weren't following what everyone else was agreeing to do in regards to Huawei and some other security issues. You've also mentioned an organization that you say that we were uninvited to, that maybe we're trying to get back into. So what do we need to do to normalize our relationship with China in regards to what normalize, not with them, but normalize in regards to relative to our allies?
Well, the government has announced that the Asia Pacific Foundation will be opening up an office in Southeast Asia to try and help us to diversify, and that the government's putting money into trying to improve the Indo-Pacific re-China expertise in our global affairs ministry and embassies abroad. So I think there's quite a significant funding for that. But it'll take a long time for us to, get the police and intelligence and diplomatic resources up to the mark in terms of language expertise and knowledge of how the Chinese system works to be able to successfully meet the significant challenges. So, I'm hoping that this will work, but we have a very steep hill to climb on this, and I'm not entirely convinced until I see the policy, the new Indo-Pacific policy, and see what the government's actually planning to do, that this will be more than trying to appease the Americans and trying to avoid alienating the Chinese side so that we won't lose our important trade relationship with China if China gets angry at us for doing what we should be doing and protecting our security and sovereignty.
We used to think, we being, I guess, the West, that if we had economic relationships with Russia, with China, with foreign countries, that we would have peace, we would have democracy, would grow, capitalism would grow, etc. I think it was actually referred to as the McDonald's philosophy, that if both countries had McDonald's restaurants, then they wouldn't attack each other. Frankly, it sounds a little silly, but it sort of makes sense. But it didn't seem to work out with Russia, and China has, to a large extent, benefited dramatically from joining the global economic community, and we collectively, China has taken more people out of poverty than any time in history have people prospered and been able to escape poverty. So there's been a lot of positive things in regards to economic connections and global trade and things. But was this belief that if we had economic relationships, we wouldn't have disputes, wars, fights, etc.? Was that belief wrong?
Turns out it was. I was very supportive of this idea that China, creating a market economy would create a middle class, and the middle class would want to have rights to protect their economic interests. That was the prevailing, political theory of the day. And I was really active as a diplomat in trying to, promote human rights dialogues and allow China to understand how our political system works, and to senior judges training colleges to try and get the Chinese judiciary to understand the benefits of an independent, fair, and impartial legal system, and providing support for China's civil sector, non-government organizations, to engender a sense of citizenship in people. But, like, as you say, with Russia, what has happened is that China was able to take advantage of our markets, opening up our markets to that country, and has now strengthened itself, and it's coming back to bite us, as a very strong China is able to exert considerable global influence, and really wants to destroy the liberal order and replace it with a political and economic order which is based with China at the center, and is based on strongman autocratic norms. China's providing surveillance technology and other means to third world dictators around the world to help them consolidate their rule and stave off the democratic demands of their people. And, we are late to the game to try and see if we can maintain the system of fair and reciprocal relations between democratic states that has been so beneficial to Canada. And it really is a bit of a crisis, and I think our government's getting the message. But are we prepared at a time of economic downturn, as Canada is currently in, to allocate the large amount of resources to our military and security services and improve our diplomatic resources to try and make a contribution to retaining the basis of global peace and prosperity, which is the UN system and the WTO? And that's still an open question. I dare say we can be talking about it more in the future as the thing develops.
So if economic integration doesn't seem to have the desired impact, our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, made some speech a couple of weeks ago that said, and I'm paraphrasing big time here, but said something to the effect of, our historical idealistic idea that this economic integration was going to create democracy worldwide and a far better world may not be true, and we just got to admit it, that there are some autocratic states that want to harm us worldwide. I'm not sure if that's at all a fair paraphrase, but that's sort of what I think she said. What does that lead us? Does that mean we gotta do this investment in military that you've mentioned? That we got to stand up to bullies? Like what? Where does that leave us from a strategic standpoint?
Well, I mean, Ms. Freeland also talked about friendshoring, quoting some U.S. doctrine that we should be trading with countries that we can trust. It's hard to know why the minister made a statement that was so at odds with what Minister Joly had been saying about the importance of maintaining economic relations with China and maintaining relations with China in areas like climate change and global health and economic stability for impoverished nations that are suffering. But New York Times does report that Ms. Freeland is the United States' leading candidate to take over as the Secretary General of NATO. So maybe she was speaking more to that audience. But that being said, Minister François-Philippe Champagne also talked about the importance of decoupling from China in trade, particularly in essential things like critical minerals, the stuff like lithium and cobalt and so on that are so important to our high-tech future that China has quite a domination of the mining resources, both in China and in the third world.
Am I correct? We've actually demanded they disinvest?
Yeah, we've disinvested 3 Chinese companies that were doing exploration in our country. And this in contrast to our previous okaying of Chinese takeover of a Canadian company that had considerable lithium resources in Argentina. So this has been a flip, 180-degree change. And yeah, we did that. We've removed some small companies, but there's still some very large companies that have considerable Chinese presence on their boards that are still in this area. So I think we have a way to go. I did have the opportunity to speak to a parliamentary study about this, and I said a few things about China, but what interested me was what the real experts were saying, which is that, to discover these critical minerals in Canada is a very expensive exploration process. You don't, often you can invest a lot of money in exploration and not, find the right mine that has the stuff, and therefore it requires government investment to the private sector if we really want to make it happen and develop those critical minerals in Canada, which we could then use to tell the United States that, if we're manufacturing electric vehicles, don't discriminate against Canada because we'll be your source of the important components for those batteries. So, it's a matter of money and political will that seems to be dominating this thing. And whether we, can put the money and political will into it, remains to be seen.
That sounds like it could be a whole nother conversation.
For sure.
We're going to have to take a break, though, because we're almost out of time, and we really could talk. We haven't even talked about human rights, which is undoubtedly a huge issue in regards to China. But I do have 2 topics I need to raise with you before we go, and so we're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments when I'm going to ask our expert Charles Burton about COVID and about North Korea. Stay with us, everybody. We're back with Charles Burton, a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, an expert on China, a former diplomat in the Canadian Embassy, someone who's lived and worked and speaks the language, etc. Charles, the Washington Post last week issued a quite an interesting article that said that we're still not getting the truth out of China in regards to COVID. And it seemed that they were referring to a whole bunch more deaths in 2019 that were never divulged before, and almost once again suggesting that that COVID didn't come from the market, but came from spill from some lab. Where are you on all this?
We don't really know. I mean, I have some friends in the Canadian military who attended the World Military Games the fall before, and they said that there were a lot of Canadians who were sick on the plane, and that they'd seen a lockdown in Wuhan while they were there. That's what they said. So they believe that COVID started quite a lot earlier than the Chinese government said. The idea that it was released in a lab does seem quite likely. There do seem to be a lot of questions about whether the lab was able to maintain the very high lab 4 criteria for handling these very noxious substances. The Chinese line that, it actually came from Fort Detrick in Maryland, or that it was foreign frozen fish that brought the virus on the packaging, does seem a bit rich to me, but I'm not a virologist. It seems most likely that it came out of that lab, and it would be highly desirable if the Chinese government had simply acknowledged that this went wrong. I mean, these errors are made. There are leaks out of labs that happen. You learn from the lesson and take measures to ensure it doesn't happen again.
Pretty big.
But what we're really dealing with here is the cover-up.
A
And the Chinese
100-year
government's
pandemic
refusal.
because of a leak. Sounds pretty. I got to ask you one last question. Charles, you're an expert. You've met people from around the world, particularly people in Asia. Who takes their daughter to a launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile?
Yeah, that does seem to be. But I mean, there's a lot of very weird stuff about North Korea, and the North Korean leader taking that lovely child to watch a ballistic missile launch was concerning. But I think what's really concerning for us is that the North Korean program continues to develop and become more and more threatening. The idea that they could launch missiles and that would reach North America is, something we really should take very seriously. And Canada has said that we plan to collaborate with our allies to try and crack down even further on North Korea. Geez, I mean, the problem really is that China is not prepared to play along now and is enabling that regime. And this is very dangerous for world peace, that's for sure.
I got to thank you very much, Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, for joining us today. China is an issue that you've been obviously very immersed in for a long period of time and talking about, and I've had the pleasure of chatting with you a few times. But I think it's a topic that we don't pay enough attention to. Back, I can't think, it was probably 10 years ago, there was a member of parliament in Mississauga that lost his position because he became too friendly with a Chinese reporter. And it appears that there's been Chinese involvement in our politics and our economics for a long time. And I think that we got to wake up and grow up and realize that there are bad actors in this world, and we got to think about what the best way is to deal with them. And there are bullies. And while she may have called Trudeau naive, I think we can all, after that interaction, call she a bully. And maybe the mafia don kind of attitude that we talked about. Anyway, Charles Burton, thank you so much. We're going to have you back and talk about some of these issues again, sir.
Thank you very much.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available on briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.